Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something absolutely wild. Picture this. You wake up, not in your cozy bedroom, but in the shadow of the Parthenon, in the golden age of Athens. Forget your morning coffee and Instagram scroll. You're about to experience a day where democracy was invented, philosophy was born, and your neighbor might just be Socrates asking you uncomfortable questions about existence. But here's the thing. You probably wouldn't last a single day, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on that fan for some soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 430 BC Athens. The good news, you're living in the most advanced civilization on Earth. The bad news, that's not saying much when advanced means your toilet is a pot that someone else has to empty. Your eyes crack open to the sound of roosters crowing across the city. But these aren't gentle farm roosters. These are Athenian roosters, with attitude, basically feathered alarm clocks that hate everyone equally. There's no snooze button, no gentle wake-up light, just aggressive poultry screaming at the dawn, like they've got a personal vendetta against sleep. You're lying on what the locals call a cline, basically a narrow wooden bed frame with rope webbing and a thin mattress stuffed with wool that's seen better decades. Your pillow? A leather cushion filled with feathers that smells suspiciously like the goose they came from. And that goose definitely wasn't free-range organic. The room is small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with mud brick walls covered in a thin layer of plaster that's already cracking. There's one tiny window, no glass, just wooden shutters that let in either too much wind or not enough air. The floor is packed earth with some clay tiles if you're lucky. Cozy it is not, but here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting I mean potentially traumatic for modern sensibilities. You're not sleeping alone. Ancient Greek homes were basically human sardine cans. Depending on your social status, you might be sharing this space with your spouse, your children, your parents, possibly a slave or two, and maybe even some livestock if the weather's bad. Privacy was a concept about as foreign as central heating. You sit up, and immediately your back reminds you that ergonomics won't be invented for another 2,400 years. But wait, there's more. The smell hits you like a chariot to the face. It's a delightful cocktail of unwashed bodies, cooking oil, smoke from oil lamps, and something that might be olive oil or might be rancid fish sauce. Hard to tell, both were equally popular. Welcome to ancient Athens, where democracy was thriving, philosophy was flourishing, and personal hygiene was more of a flexible concept. But don't think you can just lie there contemplating the meaning of existence, though that would be very Athenian of you. The day starts early, in ancient Greece, and trust me, you've got problems to solve that make your modern Monday morning seem like a spa vacation. So you've managed to extract yourself from your rope bed without falling through the webbing. Congratulations, you've already accomplished more than some hungover Athenians manage. Now comes the fun part, getting dressed in a civilization where fashion was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. First things first, underwear doesn't exist yet. That's right, you're going commando ancient Greek style. Hope you're comfortable with that concept, because there's no changing it. The ancient Greeks believed underwear was for barbarians. Literally, they called anyone who wore pants trouser-wearing savages. Imagine their horror at cargo shorts. Your outfit depends entirely on whether you've got a Y chromosome or not, because ancient Athens had very specific ideas about gender roles, and by specific, I mean rigid enough to make a Roman military formation look casual. If you're a man, you're wearing a chiton, basically a large rectangular piece of linen or wool that you wrap around yourself like a toga's casual cousin. It's held up with pins called fabula, and if you forget to put them in, well, let's just say the agora's about to get more interesting than planned. Over this, if it's chilly or you want to look important, you throw on a himation, a cloak that doubles as a blanket, towel, and fashion statement. The quality of your cloth tells everyone exactly where you stand in society. Wealthy citizens got fine bleached linen that felt almost silky. Poor citizens got coarse wool that felt like wearing a cheese grater. Slaves got whatever scraps were left over, and they were grateful for it. But here's where it gets tricky. If you're a woman, congratulations, your clothing choices just got way more complicated and way more restricted. You're wearing a peplus or chiton too, but yours has to be longer, covering you from neck to ankle. And it better stay that way, because showing skin isn't just improper, it's potentially dangerous to your social standing. Women's clothing came with more rules than a modern dress code. The peplus had to be pinned correctly at the shoulders, The fold had to fall just right, and the length couldn't be too short or too long. Get it wrong, and the neighborhood gossips would have material for weeks. And in a city-state where reputation was everything, gossip could literally ruin lives. Now comes the really fun part. Footwear. Most people went barefoot most of the time. Shoes were expensive, and the streets were, well, let's call them rustic. If you were wealthy enough to afford sandals, they were basically leather soles tied to your feet with straps. Comfortable they were not. But they did protect you from the delightful mixture of mud, animal waste, and food scraps that made up Athenian street surfaces. Hair was another social minefield. Men kept their hair short and their beards well trimmed, if you had the money for a barber. If not, you looked like you'd been styled by a particularly vindictive sheep. Women kept their hair long and elaborately braided, held up with pins, ribbons, and sometimes even small metal decorations. A woman's hairstyle could indicate whether she was married, single, mourning, or celebrating. It was like having a Facebook status update on your head. And jewelry? Oh, the Greeks loved their bling, but with purpose. Amulets for protection, rings to show status, brooches to hold clothes together. Every piece had meaning. Every ornament told a story. Unlike today, where most jewelry just tells the story of, I saw this at the mall, and my credit card didn't say no. So here you are, dressed in what amounts to designer bedsheets, wearing shoes that would make modern hikers weep, with hair that needs more maintenance than a vintage car. You look in your bronze mirror. Yes, bronze, because silver mirrors were for rich people and glass mirrors wouldn't be invented for centuries. And you see someone who looks like they're ready for either a philosophical debate or a costume party. But don't get too comfortable admiring yourself, because the day is waiting, and in ancient Athens, every day was a survival challenge, wrapped in a cultural adventure. And that's just getting dressed. Wait until you try to use the bathroom. Ah yes, the bathroom situation. This is where modern people usually start having second thoughts about time travel to ancient Athens. See, the Greeks were innovators in many fields. Democracy, theatre, philosophy, Olympic sports, personal sanitation, not so much their strongest area. Let's start with the basic. There are no bathrooms in your house. None, zero. That concept won't become standard for about 2,000 years. Instead, you've got a chamber pot, basically a ceramic bowl that serves as your personal toilet. Elegant it is not, hygienic it definitely is. But here's the really fun part. You don't get to empty this yourself if you're a citizen. That's slave work. So either you own a slave who gets the delightful job of carrying your waste through the streets to dump it outside the city walls, or you pay someone to do it. Yes, waste management was a career path in ancient Athens. Your neighborhood had a guy whose whole job was collecting chamber pots and trudging out of the city with them. Imagine that on your resume. And toilet paper. Oh, you sweet summer child. The Greeks used something called a xylospongium, a stick with a sponge on the end that was shared by everyone in the household. Shared, the same sponge, for everyone. They'd rinse it in vinegar between uses, because apparently the ancient Greeks thought vinegar was basically the answer to every hygiene problem. Spoiler alert, it was. For bigger business, wealthy families had proper latrines, essentially stone seats with holes that emptied into either pits or, if you were really fancy, running water. Public latrines were communal affairs where you'd sit side by side with your neighbors, chatting about politics while handling personal business. Privacy was not a thing. Community bonding reached levels that would make modern people deeply uncomfortable. Bathing was a weekly event if you were lucky, monthly if you were typical, and occasionally if you were poor. The wealthy had slaves heat water in large pottery jars and pour it over them in a designated bathing room. Everyone else made do with cold water, olive oil as soap, and a bronze scraper called a strigil to remove dirt and dead skin. Imagine using a butter knife to shower and you've got the right idea. But here's what's really wild. The Greeks thought daily bathing was unhealthy. They believed water weakened your skin and made you vulnerable to illness. Instead, they rubbed olive oil all over their bodies, and then scraped it off with the strigil, taking the dirt with it. It was like an ancient version of an oil change. But for humans, public baths existed, but they were more like community swimming pools filled with water that had been used by dozens of other people. The concept of chlorination was about as foreign as the concept of democracy would be to a medieval peasant. You went in cleanish and came, well, at least you were wet. Women had it even worse. They were expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness, but had fewer opportunities to actually get clean. Upper-class women rarely left their homes, so they had to make do with whatever water the slaves could heat. Lower-class women worked in markets and workshops but couldn't afford the luxury of frequent bathing. And let's talk about dental hygiene, shall we? Toothbrushes didn't exist. Toothpaste didn't exist. Dentists, well, they existed, but you didn't want to meet one. Tooth pain was treated with herbs, prayers, and occasionally having the tooth pulled out with pliers. No anesthesia, just wine and hope. The Greeks cleaned their teeth with twigs, specifically twigs from aromatic plants like mint or cinnamon. They'd chew one end until it frayed into bristles, then use it to scrub their teeth. Breath mints were herbs you chewed on. Dental floss was thin strips of leather or plant fibers. So here you are, freshly scraped with olive oil, teeth cleaned with a stick, chamber pot hopefully emptied by someone else, ready to face the dead. You smell like olives, your mouth tastes like mint twigs, and your personal hygiene routine has given you a workout that would impress modern CrossFit enthusiasts. But don't think the hard part is over. You haven't even left the house yet, and already you're learning that ancient Athens was a place where basic human needs required more planning than a modern NASA mission. Now let's talk about something modern people take completely for granted: drinking water. And by drinking water I mean the constant life or death challenge of finding something to drink that won't kill you. The ancient Greeks didn't understand germ theory, water purification, or basic sanitation, but they definitely understood that some water sources would give you diseases that ranged from uncomfortable to fatal. Most Athenian families got their water from public fountains fed by springs or aqueducts. These fountain houses were architectural marvels, beautifully decorated buildings where citizens gathered to fill their water jars while gossiping about politics, religion, and who was sleeping with who. But the water itself was an adventure. Spring water was considered the safest option, but springs were limited and often controlled by wealthy families or religious institutions. Aqueduct water was more available, but had traveled through clay pipes that might be cracked, contaminated, or infested with whatever creatures found clay pipes to be comfortable real estate. Well water was a gamble. Some wells produced clean, sweet water that families treasured for generations. Other wells produced water that tasted like it had been filtered through dirty socks and contained enough minerals to give you kidney stones just by looking at it. And some wells were contaminated by sewage from latrines, animal waste, or dead animals that had fallen in and never been removed. Here's where it gets really interesting. Most people didn't drink straight water if they could avoid it. Water was for cooking, cleaning, and mixing with wine. Drinking plain water was considered slightly barbaric and potentially dangerous. Wine was safer because the alcohol killed some of the bacteria that made water unsafe, though the ancient Greeks didn't know why wine was safer, just that it usually was. But wine presented its own challenge. Good wine was expensive. Bad wine tasted like vinegar mixed with despair, and drinking too much wine too early in the day could turn your philosophical discussions into drunken arguments that ended in fistfights. The Greeks solved this by mixing wine with water in ratios that varied depending on the occasion, the quality of both the wine and water, and how drunk they wanted to get. And speaking of basic needs, let's talk about something even more fundamental: staying warm or cool depending on the season. Ancient Athenian climate control was basically hope for the best and prepare for the worst. In winter your house became an icebox with attitude. The Mediterranean climate meant winters were mild compared to northern Europe, but mild is relative when you have no insulation, no central heating, and windows that are basically holes in the wall covered with wooden shutters. Your family gathered around a central hearth that burned wood, charcoal, or olive pits, creating a small bubble of warmth surrounded by cold air that seemed determined to suck all the heat out of your body. The smoke from the fire had nowhere to go except through holes in the roof or cracks in the walls. So winter meant choosing between being cold or being slowly asphyxiated by smoke. Most families chose a combination of both, spending winter days with red, watery eyes and persistent coughs while wearing every piece of clothing they owned, layered on top of each other. But summer was its own special kind of torture. Mediterranean summers could be brutally hot, and your house turned into a clay oven that baked everything inside it. There was no air conditioning, no fans, no ice, and definitely no swimming pools. Wealthy families had slaves who fanned them with palm fronds, but everyone else just sweated and hoped for a breeze. The streets were even worse. Narrow passages between buildings that trapped hot air and reflected sunlight until walking outside felt like being roasted alive. The smell of hot stone, sweating bodies, animal waste, and rotting food created an aromatic experience that would make a modern person nostalgic for winter blizzards. Ancient Athenians coped with summer heat by staying indoors during the hottest part of the day, wearing light-colored linen clothing, and consuming large quantities of watered-down wine. They also took afternoon naps, which sounds civilized until you realize they were sleeping on rope beds in rooms that felt like saunas, while flies and mosquitoes treated their exposed skin like an all-you-can-eat buffet. And speaking of leaving the house, Wait until you see what passes for breakfast in the cradle of Western civilization. By now you're dressed, somewhat clean, and ready to fuel up for the day ahead. Time for breakfast in ancient Athens, where the most important meal of the day was barely a meal at all. Forget your avocado toast, Greek yogurt parfait, or even basic cereal. Ancient Athenian breakfast was more like a tactical refueling stop than a dining experience. The Greeks believed that eating too much in the morning made you lazy and sluggish, which is ironic coming from a civilization that invented the siesta-like concept of the afternoon rest. Your breakfast consists of barley bread dipped in wine. Yes, wine. At sunrise, the Greeks mixed their wine with water. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric and likely to make you go insane. But still, you're starting your day with alcohol because apparently the ancient Greeks had their priorities figured out in ways that would make modern breakfast enthusiasts very uncomfortable. The bread itself is an adventure. Barley bread was the staple for most citizens, and it was about as exciting as it sounds. Imagine chewing on a dense, dark brick that tastes vaguely like cardboard with attitude. Wealthy families got wheat bread, which was lighter and actually resembled what we'd consider bread today. Poor families got barley bread mixed with whatever else was available, sometimes beans, sometimes literally just whatever grain dust was left over from better bread. If you were feeling fancy, you might add some olives, cheese, or honey. Olives were everywhere in Athens. Black ones, green ones, tiny bitter ones, big meaty ones. They were like the ancient Greek equivalent of potato chips, except they actually had nutritional value and wouldn't give you a food coma. Cheese was usually goat cheese, and it was sharp, salty, and had a texture that modern cheese lovers would find challenging. Imagine feta cheese's angry, more aggressive cousin. It was preserved in brine, wrapped in leaves, and aged in caves, which gave it flavors that were definitely an acquired taste. Honey was the ancient world's sugar, and the Greeks were absolutely obsessed with it. They put honey on everything: bread, cheese, meat, vegetables, wine. If it existed, someone had probably tried dipping it in honey. Greek honey was famous throughout the Mediterranean, especially the honey from Mount Hymettus near Athens, which was supposed to be so pure and delicious that the gods themselves preferred it. But here's the thing about ancient Greek breakfast: it was fast, not fast food fast, but actually fast. You ate quickly, standing up, and then got on with your day. Lingering over breakfast was seen as a sign of weakness or excessive luxury. The Greeks believed in starting the day with purpose, not with a leisurely morning routine. However, before you could even think about eating, there were morning religious obligations that could not be skipped. And by religious obligations, I mean a complex series of prayers, offerings, and rituals that determined whether the gods would bless your day or turn it into a cosmic disaster. Ancient Greeks believed that every moment of every day was supervised by various deities who had personal opinions about human behavior. Wake up without acknowledging Helios, the sun god. Expect a day of unfortunate accidents. Skip your morning offering to Hestia, goddess of the hearth. Your cooking fire might go out at the worst possible moment. Forget to pour a libation for your household gods. Your family could face anything from mild bad luck to catastrophic misfortune. Your morning routine included specific prayers to specific gods for specific purposes. Here's where modern people would lose their minds. You had to remember which god controlled what, when to pray to them, how to pray to them, and what offerings they expected. Get it wrong, and you weren't just being impolite. You were risking divine punishment that could affect your entire family for generations. Athena, the city's patron goddess, expected daily acknowledgement from every citizen. You faced the Acropolis, where her massive statue lived in the Parthenon, and offered a brief prayer asking for her protection over Athens and your family. This wasn't optional civic pride, it was mandatory religious duty that marked you as a loyal Athenian. Zeus, king of the gods, required recognition as the ultimate divine authority. You poured a few drops of wine on the ground while muttering prayers asking Zeus to maintain cosmic order and prevent the world from falling into chaos. Sounds dramatic. The ancient Greeks believed that without proper religious observance, the entire universe could literally fall apart. Hermes, messenger of the gods and protector of travelers, needed acknowledgement before you left your house. Even walking to the agora was considered travel that required divine protection from bandits, accidents, getting lost, or encountering hostile strangers. You touched the small statue of Hermes that stood outside your door and asked for safe passage through the city. But wait, there's more. Household gods required their own specific rituals. Every family had a collection of small statues or shrines dedicated to gods who supposedly watched over that particular household. These weren't the major Olympian deities, these were minor gods, local spirits and deified ancestors who had personal relationships with your family. Your family's guardian spirit might be a hero who had lived in your neighborhood generations ago, or a minor deity associated with your family's trade, or even the ghost of a particularly respected ancestor who had died and been promoted to divine state. These household gods needed daily offerings of food, wine, oil, or flowers, plus regular prayers asking them to protect your family from illness, poverty, accidents, and social disgrace. And then there were the seasonal religious obligations. Different times of year required different ritual activities to maintain proper relationships with gods who controlled agriculture, weather, fertility, and social harmony. Spring meant planting rituals to ensure good crops. Summer meant prayers for adequate rainfall and protection from drought. Autumn meant harvest festivals thanking the gods for food. Winter meant rituals asking the gods to bring the sun back and protect everyone from cold, hunger, and disease. But here's what really made ancient Greek religion complex. The gods had personalities, emotions, and personal relationships with each other that affected how they treated humans. Zeus and Hera were married but constantly fighting, so prayers to one might anger the other. Athena and Poseidon competed for influence over Athens, so honoring one required careful consideration of the other's feelings. Apollo and Artemis were siblings who sometimes cooperated and sometimes competed, making it tricky to ask favors from both. The gods also played favorites based on completely arbitrary criteria. Aphrodite might bless your love life because you had beautiful eyes, or curse it because your neighbor had more beautiful eyes. Ares might protect you in battle because you offered him a particularly nice sacrifice, or let you get wounded because someone else offered him a nicer sacrifice the same day. This meant that ancient Athenian religious practice required constant attention, regular offerings, and careful social navigation to avoid accidentally offending deities who could ruin your life on a whim. Every meal began with offerings to the gods. Every business transaction included prayers for divine blessing. Every journey started with rituals asking for protection. Every important decision involved consulting oracles, reading omens, or performing divination rituals to determine what the gods wanted you to do. And the gods communicated through signs that required interpretation. A bird flying from left to right meant one thing, right to left meant something else. Lightning without thunder had a different meaning than thunder without light. Dreams were messages from gods, but you needed to figure out which god was sending the message and what they were trying to tell you. Religious festivals happened constantly, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, sometimes seasonally. These weren't just community celebrations, they were mandatory civic duties that demonstrated your loyalty to Athens and your proper relationship with the gods. Skip too many festivals, and people would start wondering if you were impious, unpatriotic, or dangerously indifferent to divine authority. The Panathenaea, Athena's major festival, lasted several days and included athletic competitions, musical contests, dramatic performances, religious processions, animal sacrifices, and communal feasting. Everyone participated regardless of age, gender, or social state. Citizens, metics, and slaves all had roles in the festival activities, though different roles depending on their social position. But religious participation cost money that many families could barely afford. Festival contributions, temple offerings, household shrines, and religious celebrations required regular expenses that competed with basic necessities like food, clothing, and shelter. Poor families had to choose between religious obligations and practical survival, knowing that skipping religious duties could result in social disapproval and possibly divine punishment. Drinks were limited to water, if you could find clean water, or the watered-down wine we mentioned. Milk was for babies and invalids, coffee wouldn't be discovered for another 1,000 years, and tea was something exotic people in far-off Asia drank. So you were starting your day with the ancient equivalent of wine coolers and hoping for the best. If you were a woman, your breakfast experience was even more limited. Respectable women didn't eat with the men, and they certainly didn't drink wine with breakfast. You ate separately, often just bread and water, maybe some dried fruit if the family could afford. The concept of gender equality in meal sharing was about as advanced as their understanding of germ theory, which is to say non-existent. Children got porridge made from barley meal mixed with water, or milk, sweetened with honey if their parents were feeling generous. It was basically ancient baby food, but it was filling and nutritious enough to get them through the morning. And if you were a slave, well, you got whatever was left over, which was usually bread crusts, watered down wine dregs, and maybe some olives that were too old for the family to eat. Breakfast was about survival, not enjoyment. So there you are, fortified with wine-soaked bread and whatever else you could scrounge up, ready to face the day. Your stomach is sort of full, your head is slightly buzzed from the breakfast wine, and you're about to step out into the streets of the most powerful city-state in the ancient world. But don't get too comfortable, because the moment you step outside, you're going to realize that ancient Athens had very specific ideas about who belonged where, when and why, and those ideas probably don't match your modern sensibilities at all. Time to meet your neighbor. And trust me, it's going to be interesting. The moment you step out of your house, you're hit with the full sensory assault of ancient Athens. And by assault I mean your nose is about to file a formal complaint with your brain. The streets are narrow, maybe 10 feet wide if you're lucky, and they're lined with houses, workshops and shops all crammed together like an ancient urban Tetris game. The smell is distinct. Imagine a mixture of olive oil, wood smoke, animal waste, human sweat, leather, metal, and something that might be rotting fish, but could also be cheese. The Greeks didn't believe in waste management the way we understand it, so everything just sort of accumulates. Your street is made of packed earth, with some stone slabs if you're in a wealthy neighborhood. If it's rained recently, you're walking through mud that has the consistency of pudding and the smell of a barnyard. If it hasn't rained, you're walking through dust clouds that would make a desert storm jealous. Either way, those sandals you might have splurged on are about to become very intimate with substances you'd rather not identify. The houses around you are built right up against each other, sharing walls and probably sharing sounds, smells, and occasionally small animals that don't understand property boundaries. Most houses are 2 stories, with workshops or shops on the ground floor and living spaces upstairs. Privacy is achieved by keeping your windows small and your conversations quiet, because everyone can hear everything. But here's where it gets really interesting. The people you encounter depend entirely on what kind of person you are. And in ancient Athens, what kind of person you are is determined by factors completely outside your control: your gender, your birth status, and your wealth. If you're a male citizen, congratulations, you've won the ancient Athenian lottery. You can walk anywhere in the city, talk to anyone, participate in politics, own property, and generally enjoy freedoms that won't be universal human rights for another 2,500 years. You're basically playing life on easy mode, ancient Greek style. If you're a female citizen, well, your morning walk just got a lot more complicated. Respectable women don't wander the streets alone. You're supposed to stay in your house, unless you have a specific reason to leave, and even then you should be accompanied by a male relative or a trusted slave. The streets are considered a man's domain, and a woman walking alone is either assumed to be a prostitute, a slave, or someone up to no good. But let's say you're a male citizen taking your morning constitution. The first people you encounter are probably slaves heading to the agora with water jars, baskets of food, or tools for their masters' workshops. Slaves in Athens weren't necessarily what you might expect. They weren't all foreign captives in chains. Many were educated, some ran businesses for their masters, and quite a few looked exactly like free citizens. The only way to tell the difference was context and behavior. Then you see the metics, foreign residents who live in Athens, but aren't citizens. They're identifiable by their slightly different clothing styles, their accents, and the fact that they're usually working. Metics couldn't own land or participate in politics, but they could run businesses, and many of them were quite wealthy. They were like permanent tourists who paid taxes but couldn't vote. The citizens you encounter on the street fall into distinct categories. There are the wealthy ones, obvious from their fine clothes, well-groomed appearances, and the fact that they're followed by slaves carrying their stuff. These are the guys who own large estates, have multiple slaves, and spend their afternoons debating philosophy instead of working for a living. Then there are the middle-class citizens, craftsmen, small business owners, farmers with decent-sized plots. They wear simpler clothes, they work with their hands, and they participate in democracy when they can afford to take time off from making a living. Finally, there are the poor citizens, day laborers, small farmers, people who work for wages. They're easy to spot because they look tired, their clothes are patched, and they're usually hurrying somewhere to do work that pays just enough to keep them fed. But here's what's really fascinating. All of these men, regardless of their wealth, have political rights that modern people take for granted. They can speak in the assembly, vote on laws, serve on juries, and hold public office. It's democracy, but it's democracy for maybe 50. The rest, women, slaves, foreigners, don't get a say in how the city is run. As you walk through the streets, you notice that conversations stop when certain people approach. Social hierarchy isn't just observed in ancient Athens, it's performed. Slaves step aside for citizens. Citizens acknowledge wealthy patrons with respectful nods. Everyone shows deference to public officials, and the streets themselves tell stories. The wealthy neighborhoods have wider streets, better drainage, and houses with decorated facades. The poor neighborhoods are narrow, crowded, and smell like whatever industry keeps the residents employed: leather working, pottery, metal working, or fish processing. Children run through the streets playing games with balls, hoops, and knuckleball.
Boys and girls play together until they're about 7, and then society starts separating them. Boys continue playing in the streets, learning adult male behavior from observation. Girls disappear into houses, learning domestic skills from their mothers, and female slaves. But don't think you can just observe this social theater from a distance. The moment you interact with anyone, you're going to have to navigate rules that are invisible to you but absolutely critical to them. Say the wrong thing to the wrong person, and you could find yourself in serious social or legal trouble. Ancient Athens was friendly and welcoming to those who belonged and potentially hostile to those who didn't understand their place. And figuring out where you belong requires understanding rules that took Athenians their entire lives to master. Speaking of rules, wait until you try to buy something in the agora. That's where the real cultural education begins. After navigating the social minefield of Athenian streets, you're probably ready for the main event, the agora. This is the beating heart of Athens, the center of political, commercial, and social life. It's also about to become your crash course in ancient economics, politics, and public behavior. The agora is massive, a rectangular space about 300 by 200 meters, surrounded by covered walkways called stone. These aren't just pretty architecture, they're practical spaces where people conduct business, socialize, and take shelter from sun or rain. Under these covered areas, you'll find shops, offices, and informal gathering spaces where the real business of Athens gets done. But first, let's talk about money, because ancient Greek commerce is about to mess with your modern understanding of simple transactions. The Athenians used silver coins, drachmas, obols, and talents. 1 drachma equals 6 obols, and 1 talent equals 6,000 drachmas. Simple, right? Wrong. The problem is that prices are completely insane by modern standards. A sheep costs about 10 to 20 drachmas. A slave costs anywhere from 150 drachmas for someone unskilled to 1,000 drachmas for someone educated. A modest house might cost 2,000 drachmas, while a grand estate could cost 10 talents. That's 60,000 drachmas. But here's the kicker, a skilled craftsman makes about 1 drachma per day. So when you walk up to a bread seller, and he asks for 1 obol for a loaf of barley bread, you're paying about 1/6 of a day's wages for basic food. That honey-sweetened wheat bread you've been eyeing, that's going to cost you half a drachma, half a day's work for 1 fancy loaf of bread. And haggling isn't just expected, it's required. Prices are starting points for negotiation, not final offers. The bread seller quotes you 1 obol, you offer half an obol, he acts offended and explains his family will starve. You point out the bread looks a little stale, he agrees to 3/4 of an obol, you settle on 2/3 of an obol, and everyone walks away feeling like they've won something.
But the agora isn't just about buying bread and olive oil. It's where democracy happens. You see citizens gathered in groups, arguing about the latest political proposals, debating military strategy, gossiping about public figures. These aren't formal political meetings. This is how information spreads, and public opinion forms in ancient Athens. Over there, a group of men is discussing whether Athens should send more ships to Sicily. The conversation is heated, with everyone talking at once, gesturing dramatically, and occasionally shouting. This is normal political discourse in Athens, passionate, loud, and public. Near the fountain house, women are gathering water and sharing news. They're not supposed to participate in politics, but they're definitely talking about political events. Information flows through the women's network just as effectively as through the men's. It's just less visible and less official. In one corner, a philosopher, maybe a student of Socrates, has gathered a small crowd and is asking uncomfortable questions about justice, virtue, and the nature of knowledge. People are stopping to listen, some nodding thoughtfully, others rolling their eyes and walking away. Philosophy isn't just academic in Athens, it's street entertainment. The commercial section is a sensory overload. Pottery vendors display their wares on wooden tables, cups, bowls, storage jars, decorative pieces. The quality ranges from basic utilitarian stuff to works of art that wealthy families will use for generations. Prices vary accordingly, and the vendor will adjust his sales pitch based on how wealthy you look. Food vendors sell everything the Mediterranean has to offer. Olives in dozens of varieties, cheese from different regions, honey from various sources, fish fresh from the harbor, meat from animals slaughtered that morning. The smell is intense, a mixture of spices, oils, salt, blood, and fermentation that would overwhelm a modern nose, but was just Tuesday morning to an ancient Athenian. Textile merchants display wool and linen fabrics in natural colors, white, brown, gray, with some expensive pieces dyed in purple or red. These dyes are incredibly costly, made from specific shellfish or insects, and only the wealthy can afford truly colorful clothing. But here's where it gets interesting. Slaves are doing a lot of the actual selling. Many businesses are run by slaves who work for their masters but handle day-to-day operations independently. Some of these slaves are more educated and sophisticated than free citizens, especially if they're from conquered cities with advanced cultures. The banking happens here too, but it's not what you'd expect. Bankers are often metics, foreign residents, who can't own land but can handle money. They sit at tables with scales for weighing silver, ledgers for tracking debts, and strong boxes for storing deposits. Interest rates are brutal. 12–18% per year is normal, and 36% isn't unusual for risky loans. Legal disputes get settled right here in the agora too. Citizens argue their cases in front of crowds, sometimes with hundreds of people listening and offering opinions. Justice is public entertainment, and everyone has an opinion about who's right and who's wrong. Religious activity happens constantly. People make small offerings at the various shrines scattered throughout the agora, pour libations on the ground for the gods, and mutter prayers before important transactions. Commerce and religion are completely intertwined. You ask the gods to bless your business deals, protect your merchandise and ensure your customers pay their debts. And through it all, there's the constant background noise of democracy in action. Citizens debating, arguing, forming alliances, making enemies, spreading gossip, sharing news from other city-states, and generally participating in the messy, chaotic, brilliant experiment that is Athenian government. But don't think you can just stand there and observe. If you're a citizen, people will expect you to have opinions about public issues. If you're not a citizen, people will expect you to know your place and behave accordingly. Either way, you're about to discover that ancient Athens was a place where everyone was a political activist, whether they wanted to be or not. And speaking of politics, wait until you see how they actually make decisions in the world's first democracy. It's about to get very loud, very chaotic, and very democratic. After spending the morning in the agora, dodging flying opinions and navigating commercial negotiations that would exhaust a modern diplomat, you might think you've experienced the full intensity of Athenian public life. You haven't even scratched the surface, because if there's one thing ancient Athenians loved more than arguing about politics in the marketplace, it was arguing about politics in official political setting. And lucky you, today is an assembly day, and as a male citizen you're expected to participate in democracy whether you feel qualified or not. The assembly meets on a hill called the Mutix, about a 15-minute walk southwest of the agora. It's basically an open-air amphitheater carved into the hillside designed to hold about 6,000 citizens. And yes, 6,000 people having a political discussion at the same time is exactly as chaotic as it sounds. But here's the first culture shock. To make sure enough people show up, the city employs slaves with ropes dipped in red paint, who literally chase citizens toward the assembly area. If you try to avoid your civic duty by hiding in the agora, or wandering around the city, you might find yourself with red paint on your clothes, which is basically ancient Athens' way of giving you a scarlet letter for being a bad citizen. The assembly starts at dawn, because apparently the ancient Greeks believed democracy worked better when everyone was tired and slightly cranky. You arrive to find thousands of your fellow citizens already gathered, sitting on stone seats if you're lucky, on the ground if you're not. The noise level is somewhere between a modern sports stadium and a medieval battlefield. At the front there's a speaker's platform where citizens can address the crowd, but don't think this is like a modern political rally with carefully scripted speeches and professional sound systems. This is raw, unfiltered democracy where anyone who wants to speak just has to walk up and start talking. The crowd will either listen respectfully, shout encouragement, or boo you off the platform depending on how they feel about your idea. The agenda for today includes several items that would seem familiar to modern political observers, and several that definitely wouldn't. First up, should Athens build more warships? The military leader argues that Sparta is increasing its naval capacity and Athens needs to respond. A citizen from a wealthy family argues that the money would be better spent on public buildings. A poor citizen argues that they should spend the money on food subsidies for working families. Everyone gets to speak. The military leader has experience and the wealthy citizen has financial knowledge and skin in the game. The poor citizen represents the majority of the population. Their arguments are passionate, detailed and completely incompatible with each other. Then the voting happens, and this is where ancient democracy gets really interesting. No secret ballots, no voting machines, no privacy whatsoever. Citizens vote by raising their hands, and everyone can see how everyone else votes. Social pressure, peer influence and public accountability are all part of the process. But wait, there's more. The second agenda item is whether to ostracize a prominent citizen, literally vote to exile someone for 10 years without trial, without appeal just because the citizens decide they don't want that person around anymore. The target today is a successful general who some people think is getting too powerful and others think is necessary for the city's defense. Citizens scratch the man's name on pottery shards called ostraka and drop them in urns. If 6,000 citizens vote and the majority vote for ostracism, the guy has 10 days to leave Athens and can't come back for a decade. His property stays, his family stays, but he's gone. It's democracy's nuclear option, and they use it regularly. The debate is vicious. Supporters argue the general is a patriot who's won important victories. Opponents argue he's accumulating too much personal power and might become a tyrant. Personal attacks are not only allowed, but expected. Citizens shout accusations about the general's private life, his family background, his financial dealings, his religious practices, and his personal hygiene. Ancient Athenian political discourse makes modern political attacks look polite by comparison. There are no limits on what you can say about a public figure, no concept of staying on topic, and definitely no moderator trying to keep things civil. Democracy is a contact sport, and everyone comes prepared to fight. The third item is a proposal to increase taxes on metics, foreign residents, to fund a new temple. The debate reveals the complicated relationship Athens has with its immigrant population. Some citizens argue that metics benefit from Athenian protection and should pay more. Others argue that higher taxes will drive away the merchants and craftsmen who make the economy work. But here's what's really wild. Women, slaves, and metics can't vote on any of these issues, even though the decisions directly affect their lives. The general who might be ostracized has a wife and daughters who could lose their social standing. The metics being taxed have no voice in the tax policy. The slaves who will build the new temple if it's approved don't get to weigh in on whether it's a good use of resources. Democracy in Athens is simultaneously more participatory and more exclusive than modern democracy. If you're a male citizen, you have direct input on every government decision. If you're not, you have no input on anything, ever. The assembly runs for hours, with citizen after citizen taking the platform to share their opinions, argue with previous speakers, and propose amendments to the proposal. By noon, everyone is tired, hungry, and probably a little sunburned, but they're still debating because this is how Athenians believe government should work. Finally, the votes happen. The warship proposal passes narrowly. The ostracism vote fails. The general gets to stay, but he's been warned that his fellow citizens are watching him carefully. The temple tax passes overwhelmingly, because apparently Athenians never met a religious building project they didn't like. As you walk away from the assembly, your head spinning from hours of political theater, you realize you've just participated in something that won't exist again in human history for about 2,000 years. Direct democracy where ordinary citizens make major government decisions by simple majority vote. But don't think the day is over. You've done your civic duty, and now it's time for the ancient Athenian version of lunch. And trust me, it's going to be an adventure in flavors your modern palate has never experienced. The main meal of the day in ancient Athens happens in the early afternoon, and it's called dipe. This is when families actually sit down together and eat something more substantial than wine-soaked bread. But substantial is a relative term when you're dealing with ancient Greek cuisine. Your meal starts with bread, again, but this time it's accompanied by a variety of what the Greeks call opson, basically anything that's not bread. The bread serves as both food and utensil, because forks won't be invented for another 1,000 years, and knives are expensive items that most families can't afford to risk at the dinner table. The centerpiece of your meal is likely to be fish, because Athens is a coastal city and the Mediterranean provides a steady supply of protein that doesn't require the expense of raising livestock. But this isn't the mild, flaky fish you might be used to. Ancient Greek fish preparation involved a lot of salt, a lot of oil, and cooking methods that emphasized preservation over palatability. Anchovies are everywhere, and they're prepared in ways that would make a modern anchovy lover weep with joy or terror, depending on their tolerance for intensity. They're salt-cured, oil-packed, fermented into sauces, and used as flavoring in dishes where you wouldn't expect fish to appear. The ancient Greeks were basically the original anchovy enthusiasts. If your family could afford meat, it was usually goat or sheep, cooked in ways that made every part of the animal edible. Nothing was wasted in ancient Athens. Organ meats, blood, bones for soup, hide for leather, everything served a purpose. The cooking methods were simple: roasting over open fires, boiling in clay pots, or grilling on flat stones. Seasoning came from herbs, olive oil, vinegar and salt. But here's where ancient Greek dining gets really interesting. The vegetables. Ancient Athens had vegetables, but they weren't the vegetables you know. Their carrots were white or purple, thin and bitter. Their cabbage was more like wild kale, tough and strongly flavored. Their onions were small and so sharp they could make you cry from across the room. They had something called silphium, a plant that was so popular as seasoning and medicine that they literally harvested it to extinction. It was worth its weight in silver, used in everything from cooking to birth control, and when the last silphium plant died, the entire ancient Mediterranean went into culinary mourning. Cheese was a major part of most meals, but ancient Greek cheese was an intense experience. Most of it was made from goat or sheep milk, aged in caves or clay pots, and had flavors that ranged from sharp to aggressive to why does this taste like it's fighting back. Fresh cheese was soft and creamy, aged cheese was hard enough to use as a weapon. Wine was served with every meal, but remember it was always mixed with water. The ratio depended on the occasion, your social status, and how early in the day you wanted to be completely drunk. A normal mix was 1 part wine to 3 parts water, a strong mix was 1 to 1. Drinking unmixed wine was considered barbaric, and likely to cause madness, violence or both. But here's the really important part. Who you eat with and how you eat tells everyone exactly where you stand in the social hierarchy. If you're the head of a household, you recline on a couch and have your food served to you by slaves or family members. If you're a woman, you eat separately from the men, sitting upright, often in another room entirely. Children eat with their mothers until boys reach adolescence, when they graduate to eating with the men. Girls continue eating with the women for their entire lives, unless they marry into a family with different customs. Slaves eat standing up, in the kitchen, after everyone else has finished, and they get whatever's left over. The conversation during meals is as important as the food itself. Men discuss politics, philosophy, business, and social gossip. Women discuss household management, children, family relationships, and their own version of social gossip. Children are expected to listen and learn, not contribute to adult conversation. Meals take time, not because the food is particularly elaborate, but because eating is a social activity that includes rituals, prayers and customs that can't be rushed. Before eating, you pour a small libation of wine on the floor for the god. After eating, you might have more wine, conversation and sometimes entertainment. But don't think you can just eat and relax. Ancient Athenian meals come with rules about everything: how much you can eat, what you can say, when you can speak, how you should sit or recline, and what happens if you violate dining etiquette. Get it wrong and you'll be the subject of neighborhood gossip for weeks. And speaking of social rules, the afternoon is just getting started, because after lunch comes the part of the day where ancient Athenians really showed off their cultural sophistication, and where modern people would probably struggle the most with the social expectation. Time for the symposium. And no, it's not what you think. After your intense lunch experience, and by intense I mean you've probably consumed more olive oil in one meal than most people eat in a week, the afternoon brings you to one of ancient Athens' most famous and most misunderstood institutions. But here's the first thing you need to know. This isn't a business conference or academic seminar. A symposium in ancient Athens is basically a drinking party with intellectual pretensions, and it comes with more social rules than a modern diplomatic dinner. If you're a male citizen with any social standing, you're expected to either host symposia or be invited to them. If you're a woman, a slave or a foreigner, your participation is limited to specific roles that range from uncomfortable to degrading by modern standards. Ancient Greek social life was complicated, and the symposium is where all those complications got concentrated into one room. The setting is the andron, the men's dining room in a wealthy citizen's house. It's designed specifically for symposia, with couches arranged around the walls where men recline to eat, drink, and engage in what they consider elevated conversation. Each couch holds 2 men, and the number of couches determines the size of the party. 7 couches, 14 men, is considered ideal. More than that and the conversation becomes unmanageable. Fewer than that and you don't have enough different opinions to make things interesting. But before anyone starts drinking, there are rituals to observe. The host pours libations to the gods, especially Dionysus, the god of wine, and everyone participates in prayers and hymns. This isn't optional social etiquette, it's religious obligation. Skip the religious stuff, and you're risking divine punishment for yourself and everyone at the party. Then comes the wine mixing, and this is where things get culturally specific in ways that would confuse modern partygoers. The host doesn't just serve wine, he decides how strong the wine will be for the entire evening. The mixture is prepared in a large bowl called a crater,
and everyone drinks the same mixture at the same pace. Individual choice in alcohol consumption is not a concept. The wine-to-water ratio determines what kind of evening everyone's going to have. A weak mixture, 1 part wine to 5 parts water, means conversation and intellectual discussion. A stronger mixture, 1 to 2, means things are going to get rowdy. Equal parts wine and water means someone's probably going to do something they'll regret, and everyone else is going to remember it forever. But here's where it gets really different from modern social gatherings. Wealthy symposia include professional entertainers, musicians, dancers, acrobats, and hetairai, educated courtesans who can engage in intellectual conversation as well as provide other forms of companionship. These women are not wives or respectable female citizens. Respectable women stay home. The women at symposia are either slaves trained in music and dance, or hetairai, foreigners or freed slaves who've received education in music, poetry, philosophy and conversation. They're some of the most educated women in Athens, but their social status is ambiguous and their presence at these parties serves multiple purposes. The conversation is supposed to be elevated. Philosophy, poetry, politics. Men recite verses, propose philosophical questions, debate ethical issues, and show off their education and wit. But as the evening progresses and the wine ratio gets stronger, the conversation tends to deteriorate in predictable ways. Someone always brings up politics, and ancient Athenian political discussion after wine is about as civil as modern internet comment section. Personal attacks, accusations of corruption, threats of legal action, and occasional physical violence are all considered normal parts of political discourse after the third bowl of wine. Philosophy gets personal too. Socratic questioning, the technique of exposing the logical flaws in someone's beliefs through persistent questions, is a popular symposium game, but it's also a great way to make enemies. Imagine having your fundamental beliefs about justice, courage and virtue systematically demolished in front of your friends by someone who's had as much to drink as you have. Poetry competitions happen frequently. Someone proposes a theme, love, war, the gods, the beauty of young men, and everyone has to improvise verses. The quality ranges from brilliant to embarrassing, and everyone's required to participate whether they have poetic talent or not.
But here's what modern people would find most uncomfortable: the sexual politics of symposia. Ancient Greek attitudes towards sexuality were completely different from modern Western norms. And the symposium is where those differences become most obvious. Relationships between adult men and adolescent boys were considered normal, educational, and even noble if conducted properly. These weren't predatory relationships by ancient Greek standards. They were mentoring relationships with sexual components, governed by strict social rules about appropriate behavior, age differences, and mutual obligations. Modern people would find this disturbing, but to ancient Greeks, these relationships were part of how young men learned to be adults. The older man provided education, social connections, and protection. The younger man provided companionship, and eventually became an adult, who would mentor the next generation. But don't think this was a free-for-all of inappropriate behavior. Ancient Greeks had very specific rules about what was acceptable, when, with whom, and under what circumstance. Violation of these rules could result in social disgrace, legal penalties, or violence from the young man's family. Meanwhile, relationships with women at symposia followed completely different rules. Hetairai were expected to be intellectually engaging companions who could discuss philosophy, recite poetry, and provide witty conversation. They weren't just decoration, they were participants in the intellectual life of the party, often more educated than the wives waiting at home. But their position was precarious. They depended on male patrons for financial support, had no legal rights, and could be discarded without notice. Some hetairai became wealthy and influential, but they were always outsiders to respectable society. As the evening progresses, the symposium often includes games that would seem familiar to modern partygoers: drinking games, word games, riddles, and contests of wit. But they also include activities that definitely wouldn't, like kotobos, a game where you flick wine dregs at a target while declaring your love for someone. The evening ends when everyone's too drunk to continue the conversation, when someone starts a fight, or when dawn breaks, and people remember they have responsibilities the next day. Participants stumble home through the dark streets of Athens, supported by slaves carrying torches, probably making enough noise to wake the entire neighborhood. But here's the thing about symposia: they weren't just entertainment. They were where business deals got made, political alliances formed, and social relationships maintained. If you weren't included in symposium culture, you were excluded from significant parts of Athenian social and political life. And if you think the symposium was intense, Wait until you experience ancient Athenian religious life, because the gods are about to demand your attention in ways that make modern religious obligations look casual. By now, you've survived breakfast wine, navigated the social hierarchy of the agora, participated in direct democracy, eaten lunch with your hands, and either attended or been excluded from a symposium, depending on your gender and social status. You might think you've experienced the full range of ancient Athenian culture. You haven't even begun to understand how thoroughly religion penetrated every aspect of daily life in ancient Athens. And by religion, I don't mean an hour on weekends at a nice building with comfortable seating and air conditioning. I mean a complex system of gods, rituals, festivals, and obligations that influenced every decision you made from dawn to dusk. First, understand that the ancient Greeks believed their gods were real, active, and personally invested in human affairs. Not metaphorically real, not spiritually real, actually real, living on Mount Olympus, interfering in human lives on a daily basis, and taking offense when they felt disrespected. Athena, the city's patron goddess, isn't just a symbol of wisdom and warfare. She's a real person who chose Athens as her special city, gave the Athenians the olive tree, and expects regular recognition for her generosity. The massive statue of Athena in the Parthenon isn't just art, it's literally the goddess's house where she lives when she's visiting Athens. Zeus controls the weather, and when it rains or storms, that's Zeus making decisions about what kind of day Athens is going to have. Poseidon controls the seas, which is crucial for a city that depends on maritime trade. Dionysus controls wine, vegetation, and fertility, basically everything that makes life worth living. But these aren't distant, abstract deities. They're local gods, with local preferences, and they play favorites. Athena supports Athens against Sparta. Apollo might prefer one family over another. Aphrodite could decide she likes your neighbor better than she likes you, and suddenly your love life becomes a disaster while his becomes a romantic comedy. Your morning routine includes prayers and small offerings to whatever gods seem relevant to your day's activities. Going to the agora? Better acknowledge Hermes, the god of commerce and communication. Working with your hands? Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship, expects recognition. Leaving the city? Artemis protects travelers, but only if you ask nicely. These aren't elaborate ceremonies, they're quick acknowledgement. You pour a few drops of wine on the ground, mutter a prayer, maybe leave a small piece of food at a shrine, but skip them, and you're risking divine punishment that could range from bad luck to catastrophic disaster. The city is full of shrines, temples, and sacred spaces, where you're expected to show proper respect. Some are major temples with priests, elaborate rituals, and expensive offerings. Others are small neighborhood shrines maintained by local residents. All of them are active, functioning religious sites where gods actually live or visit regularly. But here's where ancient Greek religion gets really different from modern religious practice. It's completely public, completely social, and completely integrated into civic life. There's no separation between religious and secular activities, because the gods are involved in everything. Political meetings begin with prayers and sacrifices. Business transactions include asking the gods for blessing. Legal proceedings involve swearing oaths by the gods that could result in divine punishment if you lie. Military campaigns require extensive religious rituals to ensure divine support. And the festivals, the festival. Ancient Athens celebrates more religious festivals than a modern city celebrates anything. There are festivals for individual gods, festivals for agricultural seasons, festivals for military victories, festivals for family occasions, and festivals just because the city feels like having a party with religious overtone. The Panathenea, Athena's festival, happens every year, and includes athletic competitions, musical contests, dramatic performances, and a massive procession through the city where everyone participates regardless of age, gender, or social status. Every 4 years there's a great Panathenea that's even more elaborate, with participants from all over the Greek world. The city Dionysia is where the great dramatic tragedies and comedies are performed, but it's not just entertainment, it's religious ritual. The plays honor Dionysus, the audiences participate in religious ceremonies, and the entire event is considered an act of worship that brings the god's blessing to the city. During these festivals, normal social rules are temporarily suspended. Slaves get time off, women leave their houses to participate in processions, children get special foods and treats, and everyone dresses in their best clothes to honor the gods. But religious participation isn't optional. If you don't participate in community festivals, people notice. If you don't maintain the family shrines, your neighbors gossip. If you don't show proper respect at temples, priests remember. Religious conformity is social conformity. and social conformity is how you maintain your position in Athenian society. Personal religious practice is more flexible, but it's still expected. Most families have household shrines where they honor their ancestors, family gods, and personal patron deities. These shrines require daily attention, fresh flowers, small food offerings, libations of wine or oil, and regular prayers for family welfare. Women have special religious roles that give them public visibility they don't get in other areas of life. Many festivals are women-only events where respectable wives and daughters leave their homes to participate in ceremonies that can last for days. These festivals are some of the few occasions where women have independent social lives separate from male family members. But religious obligations come with costs. Temple offerings, festival participation, household shrines, and religious celebrations require money that many families can barely afford. Poor citizens skip some religious activities not because they're less pious, but because they can't afford the expected contribution. The gods notice everything. They remember who honors them and who doesn't, who gives generous offerings and who's stingy, who participates sarcastically in festivals and who just goes through the motion. Divine favor is earned through consistent religious behavior, and divine punishment follows religious negligence. But here's the really important thing about ancient Greek religion. It's not about personal salvation or moral behavior in the way modern people understand religion. It's about maintaining proper relationships between humans and gods, so that life continues to function smoothly. The gods don't particularly care if you're a good person by modern ethical standards. They care if you show them proper respect, honor their festivals, maintain their shrines, and acknowledge their power over human affairs. Be generous to the gods, and they'll be generous to you. Neglect the gods, and they'll make your life miserable. So as the sun sets on your day in ancient Athens, you're facing evening religious obligations that will determine whether you sleep peacefully or spend the night worrying about divine retribution. And trust me, ancient Greek gods were not forgiving about oversight. Time for evening prayers, household rituals, and hoping you haven't accidentally offended any deities during your busy day of navigating ancient Athenian life. But before you can settle in for the night, there's one more aspect of ancient Athenian life you need to experience: the family dynamics that would make modern family therapy seem like a casual conversation. As evening approaches and you return to your house after a day of political participation, commercial negotiation and religious obligation, you're about to discover that ancient Athenian family life operated according to rules that would shock modern sensibilities and challenge every assumption you have about gender roles, child rearing, and personal relationships. The moment you cross your threshold, you enter a world that's completely separated from the public life you've been experiencing all day. If you're a male citizen, you're moving from a world where you have rights, voice, and authority to a domestic sphere where different rules apply. If you're a female citizen, you're returning to the only world where you have any influence at all. Ancient Athenian houses are designed to enforce gender segregation that was considered essential for maintaining family honor and social stability. The house is divided into men's areas, andron, and women's areas, gonarchaeon, and these aren't just different rooms, they're different social universes with different rules, different activities and different expectations. The women's quarters are where wives, daughters, female slaves, and female relatives spend most of their time. It's typically on the second floor or in the back of the house, away from street entrances where strange men might see the women. Windows are small and high to prevent outsiders from looking in and women from looking out too much. But don't imagine this as a prison, it's more like a parallel society. The women's quarters include sleeping rooms, work areas for textile production, storage spaces and social areas where women visit with female relatives and neighbors. Women have their own social networks, their own sources of information, and their own ways of exercising influence over family decisions. However, the restrictions are real and serious. Respectable women don't interact with men outside their family. They don't participate in public life, don't handle money, don't make legal decisions, and don't have independent social lives that include mixed gender activities. But here's where it gets complicated. These restrictions apply differently depending on social class. Wealthy women have more restrictions because they can afford to live according to ideal standards. Poor women work outside the house, interact with male customers, handle money for family businesses, and generally have more practical freedom because the family needs their economic contribution. The children you encounter in ancient Athenian families are living completely different lives from modern children, and those differences begin at birth. First, not all children who are born actually become part of the family. The father has the legal right to reject newborn children, and rejected infants are left outside the city to die or be picked up by strangers. This isn't considered murder or child abuse, it's considered practical family planning. Families reject children they can't afford to raise, children with obvious disabilities, or simply children of the wrong gender if they already have enough daughters. It's brutal by modern standards, but it's completely normal by ancient Greek standards. Children who are accepted into the family live in a world with very different expectations for boys and girls. Boys are treasures who will inherit property, carry on the family name, and take care of parents in old age. Girls are temporary family members who will eventually marry into other families and become those families' responsibility. Boys receive education that prepares them for adult male citizenship, reading, writing, mathematics, music, poetry and physical training. The goal is to produce citizens who can participate in democracy, serve in the military, manage property, and represent the family with honor in public life. Girls receive education that prepares them for marriage and household management, textile production, cooking, household accounting, child care, and enough reading and writing to manage domestic affairs. The goal is to produce wives who can run households efficiently, produce legitimate children, and maintain family honor through proper behavior. But childhood ends early by modern standards. Boys become adolescents around 40 and start participating in adult male society through relationships with older men who serve as mentors, lovers, and social sponsors. Girls are often married by age 40 or 15 to men who are typically 10-15 years old. These marriages aren't love matches in the modern sense. They're business arrangements between families designed to combine property, create political alliances, and produce legitimate children who will inherit from both families. The bride and groom often meet for the first time at their wedding ceremony, but marriage doesn't mean women gain independence or authority. A married woman moves from her father's authority to her husband's authority. She can't own property independently, can't make legal contracts, and can't initiate divorce proceedings. If her husband dies, she comes under the authority of his male relatives or returns to her father's family. However, within the household, married women have significant responsibility and influence. They manage slaves, oversee food production and textile work, handle household finances, and make daily decisions about family life. A competent wife is essential for family prosperity, and husbands depend on their wives' skills, even though women don't receive public recognition for their contribution. The relationship between husbands and wives in ancient Athens is complicated by the fact that they live in different social worlds. Husbands spend their days in public spaces, participating in politics, conducting business, and socializing with other men. Wives spend their days in domestic spaces, managing households, raising children, and socializing with other women. They don't share social activities, don't have mutual friends of both genders, and don't participate in the same recreational activity. Their marriage is a working partnership focused on practical goals rather than emotional intimacy or shared interests. But emotional relationships do exist within these constraints. Ancient Greek literature includes examples of married couples who clearly care about each other, worry about each other's welfare, and work together to achieve family goals. The relationships just operate according to different rules and expectations than modern marriage. Slavery is woven into family life in ways that modern people would find disturbing but ancient Athenians considered normal. Most middle-class families own at least one or two slaves, and wealthy families might own dozens. Slaves handle domestic work, child care, business operations, and skilled crafts. But slavery in ancient Athens isn't necessarily the brutal plantation system that modern people associate with the word. Many slaves are educated, some earn independent income, and a few even own property or businesses. Some slaves are treated almost like family members, while others are treated as disposable tools. It depends on the individual family, the specific slave's skills and personality, and the economic pressures the family faces. Freed slaves often continue working for their former masters as paid employees, and their children might marry into citizen families if they're successful enough. Social mobility through slavery exists, but it's limited and precarious. As evening settles over your ancient Athenian household, the family gathers for dinner, evening prayers, and the domestic rituals that end each day. Conversations focus on family business, local gossip, children's education, and plans for upcoming festivals or ceremonies. But the conversations happen within strict social boundaries. Men talk to men about politics, business, and public affairs. Women talk to women about household management, family relationships, and social news. Children listen and learn their future roles by observing adult behavior. It's a family structure that's simultaneously more restrictive and more stable than modern family arrangement. Everyone knows their role, Everyone understands their responsibilities, and everyone accepts limitations that modern people would find suffocating. But it's also a family structure that depends on inequality, restricts individual freedom, and subordinates personal desires to family obligations in ways that make ancient Athenian family life a fascinating, but difficult experience for anyone with modern expectations about personal autonomy and gender equality. And as night falls over ancient Athens, you're about to discover that even sleep comes with cultural expectations and practical challenges that make modern bedtime routines seem luxuriously simple. As the last light fades from the sky over Athens, and the household settles into evening routine, you're about to experience the final challenge of your day in ancient Greece. Actually getting to sleep in a world without electric lights, central heating, or any of the comfort technologies that modern people take for granted. But first, there are evening rituals that can't be skipped, because ancient Athenians believed that how you ended your day influenced what the gods would send you during the night. This isn't casual superstition, it's practical insurance against nightmares, illness, theft, fire, and all the other disasters that could strike a household during the vulnerable hours of darkness. The evening meal was simpler than the afternoon daimon, usually consisting of leftovers from lunch, bread, wine, and whatever fresh food was available. But the important part wasn't the food, it was the ritual of gathering the household together, offering prayers to the gods, and performing the ceremonies that protected the family through the night. Now let's talk about something that would make modern people appreciate their memory foam mattresses, adjustable thermostats, and blackout curtains, what it actually meant to sleep in ancient Athens, where a good night's sleep was never guaranteed and comfort was definitely optional. Your sleeping arrangements depended entirely on your social status, but even wealthy Athenians slept in conditions that would make modern camping seem luxurious. The bed itself was a wooden frame with rope or leather webbing, topped with a mattress that was basically a cloth bag stuffed with whatever materials the family could afford. Wealthy families had mattresses stuffed with soft wool that had been cleaned, carded, and prepared by skilled slaves. The wool was layered to provide cushioning and wrapped in linen covers that could be removed and washed occasionally. These mattresses were almost comfortable by ancient standards, though they would feel like sleeping on a pile of sweaters to modern people, accustomed to spring coils and foam padding. Middle-class families had mattresses stuffed with coarser wool mixed with straw, reed fibers, or even dried grass. These mattresses were lumpy, scratchy, and had a tendency to develop mysterious bumps and valleys that made finding a comfortable sleeping position feel like solving a geometric puzzle. The straw and grass also attracted insects, mice, and other small creatures who considered your bed to be prime real estate. Poor families had mattresses stuffed with whatever was available: old rags, dried leaves, straw that was too old for animal bedding, or just additional layers of rough cloth. These weren't so much mattresses as they were slightly padded sleeping surfaces that provided minimal protection from the wooden bed frame underneath. But the mattress was just the beginning of your comfort challenges. Pillows were leather or cloth bags filled with feathers, wool, or grain, and by feathers I mean feathers that still smelled like the birds they came from, complete with occasional quills that would poke you in the head at random intervals throughout the night. Some families used wooden headrests instead of pillows, essentially carved wooden blocks that kept your head elevated, but provided about as much comfort as sleeping on a stack of books. These headrests were supposed to keep your elaborate hairstyles from getting messed up while you slept, but they also guaranteed you'd wake up with a stiff neck and possibly a headache. Blankets were wool, scratchy, heavy wool that felt like sleeping under a sheep that had developed attitude problems. The quality of the wool depended on your family's wealth, but even the finest wool blankets were rough by modern standards. They were also heavy enough to make rolling over feel like a workout, and they trapped body heat in ways that could make you feel like you were being slowly cooked. But temperature regulation was the real nightmare. Ancient Athenian houses had no insulation, no central heating, and windows that were basically holes in the walls covered with wooden shutters. In winter you went to bed cold and woke up even colder. Your breath formed clouds in the air, and ice sometimes formed inside the house during particularly cold nights. Wealthy families had braziers, metal containers filled with burning charcoal that provided heat but also produced toxic fumes and presented constant fire hazards. These braziers could warm a small area around them, but the heat didn't distribute evenly, so you might have one side of your body roasted while the other side froze. Most families dealt with cold nights through the ancient Greek version of a group hug. Everyone slept in the same room, sharing body heat, blankets, and personal space in ways that would make modern people claustrophobic. Parents, children, elderly relatives, and sometimes trusted slaves all slept together in communal sleeping areas, where privacy was non-existent but warmth was shared. Summer sleeping presented its own special torture. Mediterranean summers could be brutally hot, and houses that had no air conditioning or fans became ovens that baked everything inside them. The same thick walls that provided some protection from winter cold trapped summer heat, creating indoor temperatures that could be higher than the outdoor temperature. Windows were small and often kept closed for security reasons, so air circulation was minimal. The wooden shutters that kept out winter wind also kept out summer breezes, forcing families to choose between security and ventilation. Most chose security, which meant sleeping in stuffy, overheated rooms that felt like saunas. The noise level would drive modern people insane. Ancient Athens never really slept. There was always someone awake, something happening, some sound echoing through the narrow streets. Dogs barked constantly, not just at strangers but at each other, at cats, at imaginary threats, and sometimes apparently just for the joy of making noise. Roosters crowed not just at dawn but throughout the night, because ancient roosters had no respect for traditional schedules. Cats fought, yowled and conducted what sounded like feline dramatic performances on rooftops and in alleyways. Mice and rats scurried through walls, making scratching and squeaking sounds that could keep light sleepers awake for hours. Drunk citizens stumbling home from symposia provided regular entertainment. Singing, shouting, philosophical debates conducted at maximum volume, and occasional fights that could wake entire neighborhoods. The city watch made rounds throughout the night, their sandals slapping on stone streets and their voices carrying through the darkness as they called out that all was well, or that it wasn't. Security concerns made peaceful sleep difficult, even when noise levels were manageable. Houses had wooden doors secured with simple locks that could be broken by anyone with determination and basic tools. Wealthy families had slaves who stayed awake to guard property, but most families just barred their doors and hoped for the best. Burglary was common enough that most families had specific plans for nighttime emergencies. Women and children knew where to hide if strangers broke into the house. Men slept with weapons, knives, clubs, or swords within easy reach. Everyone understood that calling for help might not bring assistance quickly enough to matter. Fire was an ever-present danger that could turn a peaceful night into a catastrophe. Oil lamps provided light but could tip over and ignite bedding, clothing or wooden furniture. Braziers for warmth could set fire to anything combustible that got too close. Cooking fires in hearths could spread to wooden beams or thatched roofs if sparks escaped the fireplace. Most fires started at night when people were asleep and couldn't respond quickly to contain them. Houses were built close together with shared walls, so a fire in one house could spread rapidly to neighboring buildings. Entire neighborhoods could be destroyed in a single night, leaving families homeless and destitute. Medical issues that would be minor inconveniences today became major sleep disruptions in ancient Athens. Tooth pain was excruciating and untreatable except with herbs that didn't work very well, or wine that just made you drunk and still in pain. Skin conditions, rashes, and insect bites became more irritating at night when you couldn't distract yourself with daytime activity. Digestive problems from unfamiliar foods, contaminated water, or simply the stress of ancient daily life could keep you awake with cramps, nausea, or urgent trips to the chamber pot. And remember that chamber pot was in the same room where everyone else was trying to sleep. Respiratory problems were common due to smoke from oil lamps, cooking fires, and braziers. Many Athenians developed chronic coughs from constantly breathing smoke-filled air. These coughs were worse at night when lying down, creating a symphony of hacking and wheezing that could keep entire households awake. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of ancient sleep was the belief system surrounding dreams and nighttime supernatural activity. Ancient Greeks believed that dreams were visits from gods, messages from the dead, or warnings about future events. A nightmare wasn't just a random neural firing, it was a supernatural communication that required interpretation and possibly religious action. Bad dreams were considered signs of divine displeasure, supernatural attack, or warnings about impending disaster. If you woke up from a disturbing dream, you were supposed to perform purification rituals, make offerings to appropriate gods, or consult religious specialists about what the dream meant and how to prevent whatever catastrophe it might be predicting. Sleep disorders, insomnia, and night terrors were all interpreted as supernatural problems rather than medical conditions. Treatment involved religious rituals rather than medical intervention. Some people slept in temples, hoping that healing gods would visit them in dreams and provide supernatural cures for their sleep problems. The darkness itself was considered dangerous and filled with supernatural entities that were more active at night than during the day. Ghosts, spirits, demons and malevolent gods were all believed to move freely through the darkness, looking for opportunities to harm sleeping humans or cause household disasters. Protection from these supernatural threats required specific rituals and precautions. Oil lamps were kept burning, not just for light but to ward off evil spirits that supposedly feared fire. Iron objects were placed near beds because evil spirits supposedly disliked iron. Herbs like garlic or mint were scattered around sleeping areas to repel supernatural enemies. But despite all these challenges, the discomfort, the noise, the security concerns, the medical issues, and the supernatural fears, ancient Athenians did eventually fall asleep. They developed cultural practices and coping mechanisms that helped them deal with the difficulties of nighttime in the ancient world. Extended families shared sleeping spaces not just for warmth but for psychological security. No one had to face the darkness alone. Children slept with parents until adolescence, and elderly relatives often shared beds with adult children and their families. This communal sleeping arrangement provided physical comfort and emotional reassurance that helped people relax despite the challenging conditions. Storytelling was a crucial bedtime activity that helped families bond while providing entertainment during the long hours of darkness before sleep came. Parents told children stories about gods, heroes, moral lessons, and family history. These stories served multiple purposes. They preserved cultural knowledge, strengthened family relationships, provided distraction from discomfort, and created a sense of continuity between generations. Religious practices provided psychological comfort even when they didn't provide physical protection. Believing that gods watched over sleeping families, that ancestors protected their descendants, and that proper rituals could prevent disasters helped people feel safer and more secure as they tried to fall asleep. And finally, sheer exhaustion was probably the most effective sleep aid available to ancient Athenians. After a day of physical labor, political participation, commercial negotiation, religious obligations and social responsibilities, most people were tired enough to sleep despite uncomfortable beds, challenging temperatures, disturbing noises, and security concerns. The combination of physical fatigue, alcohol consumption, remember that watered-down wine with every meal, and psychological resignation to circumstances beyond their control probably helped ancient Athenians achieve sleep even under conditions that would keep modern people awake all night. As you finally drift off to sleep in your ancient Athenian bed, surrounded by family members, slaves, possibly some small livestock, and the constant background noise of an ancient city settling into night, you might reflect on the day you've just experienced. You've survived breakfast, navigated complex social hierarchies, participated in direct democracy, haggled in the agora, observed or been excluded from intellectual drinking parties, fulfilled extensive religious obligations, and managed family relationships that operate according to rules that would challenge modern understanding of gender roles, individual rights, and personal freedom. You've eaten food prepared without refrigeration, traveled on roads without paving, conducted business without banks as we know them, and participated in government without professional politicians or bureaucratic institutions. You've lived through one day in the world's first democracy, and you've discovered that democracy in 430 BC was simultaneously more participatory and more exclusive than modern democratic systems. But here's what you might not have fully realized until this moment of exhausted reflection. You've just experienced the daily life of the most advanced, most sophisticated, most culturally influential civilization that had ever existed on Earth up to that point in human history. Ancient Athens in 430 BC was the cutting edge of human civilization. Their problems weren't signs of primitive conditions, they were the problems of people pushing the boundaries of what human societies could achieve with the technology, knowledge, and social organization available to them. Their solutions weren't perfect by modern standards, but they were brilliant innovations that laid the foundation for everything that came after: democracy, philosophy, theater, architecture, historical writing, scientific thinking, and the very idea that human beings could create societies based on reason, debate and civic participation rather than just tradition, force, and divine authority. The discomforts you've experienced, the scratchy wool blankets, the wine-soaked breakfast bread, the communal toilets, the lack of privacy, weren't signs of ignorance or backwardness. They were the trade-offs that people made to live in a society where ordinary citizens could stand up in public assemblies and change government policy with their votes, where philosophers could question everything without being executed for heresy, where playwrights could mock politicians and gods in public theaters, and where individual merit could sometimes overcome the accidents of birth. Ancient Athens wasn't perfect. It excluded women, accepted slavery, and limited citizenship to a privileged minority.
But within those limitations, it created something that had never existed before and wouldn't exist again for centuries. A society where free citizens could participate directly in their own government, where intellectual inquiry was valued over blind obedience, and where human reason was considered a tool for solving social problems. The bed you're lying on is uncomfortable, but it's in a city where people believed that citizens should think for themselves, question authority, and take responsibility for their collective future. The food you ate today was strange and often unpalatable, but it was prepared and consumed in a society that invented theater, developed philosophy, and created the intellectual foundations of Western civilization. The social restrictions you encountered were often harsh and unfair, but they existed alongside innovations in political participation, artistic expression, and intellectual freedom that wouldn't be matched for millennia. And now, as you drift off to sleep in ancient Athens, you can hear the night sounds of a city that's about to enter its golden age, the age of Pericles, Socrates, Sophocles, and the cultural achievements that people will still be studying and admiring too.
But you also know something that the sleeping Athenians around you don't know. This golden age is fragile. Within a few years, plague will devastate the city. War with Sparta will drain Athens' resources and eventually destroy its empire. The democracy you participated in today will eventually collapse under the pressures of military defeat, economic crisis, and social upheaval. The comfortable, prosperous, confident Athens, where you spent today, will face challenges that will test every assumption about democracy, citizenship, and human nature. Some of those challenges will be met successfully, others will result in catastrophic failures that will echo through history. But tonight, as you fall asleep to the sounds of roosters, cats, mice, and the occasional drunk citizen, none of that has happened yet. Tonight, you're sleeping in the most remarkable city that has ever existed, surrounded by people who are creating the intellectual and political foundations of everything that will come after. Your day in ancient Athens is ending, but the civilization you've just experienced will continue to influence human thought and culture for millennia. The democracy you participated in, the philosophy you overheard, the theater you might have attended, and the social innovations you observed will become the raw material for future civilizations to build upon, modify, and improve. And as you finally succumb to exhaustion on your rope bed, covered by scratchy wool blankets, surrounded by snoring family members, and the ambient noise of an ancient city, you might realize that you've just lived through one of the most intellectually stimulating, politically engaging, and culturally significant days in human history. Even if it was uncomfortable, confusing, and occasionally terrifying, even if you probably wouldn't want to do it again, even if you're very grateful that toilets, toothbrushes, and coffee were eventually invented. Because that's the thing about historical greatness. It's often much more impressive to read about than to actually experience. The people who create lasting civilizations usually don't realize they're living in historically significant time. They're just trying to get through their days, solve their problems, and create better lives for themselves and their families. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, those daily struggles, practical solutions, and cultural innovations add up to something extraordinary, something that changes human history, something that creates new possibilities for what human societies can achieve. Ancient Athens in 430 BC was one of those rare moments when ordinary people, dealing with ordinary problems, managed to create something extraordinary that would outlast their city, their civilization, and their entire way of life. And you just spent a day living in it. Sleep well, ancient Athenian. Tomorrow brings new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to participate in the grand experiment of democracy. But tonight, you can rest knowing that you've experienced something truly remarkable, a day in the life of the world's first democratic citizen. The roosters will wake you at dawn, the wine-soaked bread will be waiting for breakfast, and the agora will be full of citizens eager to argue about politics, philosophy, and the proper way to honor the gods. But that's tomorrow's adventure. Tonight, you sleep in ancient Athens, surrounded by the sounds and smells of the most culturally influential city in human history. And despite the discomfort, the confusion, and the constant challenges, it's been an absolutely unforgettable day. Even if you're looking forward to indoor plumbing, central heating, and coffee when you wake up in the 21st century. But maybe, just maybe, you'll also miss the intensity of a city where every citizen was expected to participate in democracy, where philosophy was street conversation, where gods walked among mortals, and where the most important decisions about war, peace, and justice were made by ordinary people standing up in public assemblies and voting with their hands. Because that's what you experienced today in ancient Athens, not just discomfort and cultural shock, but genuine democracy in action, the real thing, the original, the political innovation that changed human history and created possibilities that people are still working to achieve today. Sweet dreams, time traveler, you've earned them. And when you wake up tomorrow, whether it's in ancient Athens or in the modern world, you'll know something that most people never experience, what it actually felt like to live in one of history's most remarkable civilizations, during one of its most creative and influential periods. That knowledge is worth a few uncomfortable nights on rope beds covered by scratchy wool blankets, even if you never want to drink wine for breakfast again. If you're still awake and you actually made it through this entire ancient Athenian adventure without falling asleep, first of all, congratulations on your stamina. That's more endurance than most ancient Athenians showed during their own political assembly. If you enjoyed this journey back to 430 BC, and by enjoyed, I mean you found it entertainingly horrifying, rather than just plain horrifying, then maybe consider subscribing, because apparently you're the kind of person who enjoys learning about civilizations, where breakfast included alcohol, toilets were communal experiences, and democracy involved 6,000 people shouting at each other on a hillside. And if you're wondering why anyone would voluntarily listen to someone talk about ancient bathroom habits, olive oil hygiene routines, and the social complexities of symposia for this long, well, that's between you and whatever gods you pray to before sleep. Thanks for spending your evening with me. In ancient Athens, where the philosophy was groundbreaking, the democracy was revolutionary, the architecture was magnificent, and the daily life was, well, let's just say you probably appreciate your modern conveniences more now than you did an hour ago. Sweet dreams, and try not to dream about shared sponges on sticks. That's the kind of nightmare that even ancient Greek gods wouldn't wish on their enemies. Now get some sleep. Unlike our ancient Athenian friends, you probably have comfortable beds, clean sheets, private bathrooms, and central heating. Use them wisely. Good night. P.S. If you wake up tomorrow craving wine-soaked bread for breakfast, that's between you and your therapist. I'm just the messenger. The end.